Hey everyone, I don't know about you, but February 2025 has felt like drinking from a fire hose.
Oh,
With
yeah.
Hurricane Helene, wildfires in LA, and then that election on top of everything else, I'm feeling a little
Yeah, no kidding.
completely overwhelmed.
I think a lot of people are feeling that way, and researchers have a name for it.
Oh, really?
It's called news fatigue.
News fatigue, huh?
And it's not just feeling overwhelmed, it's a psychological response to this constant barrage of information, especially when a lot of it is, stressful or negative.
Definitely. And it's not just the volume of news either, right?
Yeah.
It's the
It's heavy stuff.
yeah, it's the emotional weight of it all. We were looking at that Scientific American article, the one about why the news feels so overwhelming, and I felt like they were reading my mind when they talked about how heavy it all feels emotionally.
Absolutely. Every headline just has this, extra weight of anxiety to it. And, thinking back to the start of Trump's second term.
Oh, yeah.
The speed of change was like nothing we'd ever seen before. Legal battles, policy shifts.
It was a whirlwind.
It was a total whirlwind, and that kind of rapid change really takes a toll.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's picture those first few months of his second term. You're scrolling through your feed, and every other post is about some new development, some court case, some policy.
It was exhausting.
I know. And even if you weren't directly affected by any of it,
Just reading about it.
just reading about it was exhausting.
And that's not by accident. The Scientific American article actually mentioned Steve Bannon.
Oh, yeah, he was a big part of Trump's first term.
Right, and he was famous for this idea of flooding the zone.
Flooding the zone. What does that even mean?
Basically overwhelming the media with so much information that it's impossible to even process it.
Let alone fact check it all.
Exactly. So you're not even sure what's real and what's not.
So it's like a deliberate strategy
Yeah.
of information overload.
Exactly. And it's actually very similar to tactics they used in Soviet disinformation campaigns.
Wow.
The goal is to just create so much chaos and confusion
That people just keep up?
that people just tune out and say, I can't deal with this anymore.
Yeah, which is exactly how I felt back then.
I think a lot of people did.
But the Scientific American article goes deeper than that. They explain how this flood of news, especially when it's negative, actually triggers a primal fear response
Oh,
in our
yeah.
brains.
That's right.
So it's like,
It's fascinating, really,
Yeah.
because when we're afraid, our brains kind of shift into this survival mode.
fight or flight.
Exactly, and it's like our higher level thinking, the part that helps us analyze and make reasonable decisions, it all gets put on hold.
Interesting.
And suddenly we're more likely to jump to conclusions, overestimate threats, and make decisions based on gut feeling rather than thinking things through.
So it's not just that the news is scary,
Right.
it's that the fear makes us worse at processing all of the information.
Exactly.
That is kind of terrifying when you think about it.
It is. It's like, imagine you're driving in a blizzard.
Okay.
The snow's coming down, hard visibility is low.
You're tense, dripping the heel.
Right, and it's so much harder to react calmly and make good decisions in that heightened state of fear.
I see your point.
That's basically what's happening in our brains when we're constantly bombarded with negative news.
We can't think straight.
Not as well, no.
So we're getting hit with all this information overload, our brains are freaking out.
And then it gets worse.
What do you mean?
Well, the article talked about how fear turns into other emotions,
Like,
anger and helplessness.
oh yeah, that makes sense. If you're constantly afraid and you feel like you have no control over the situation,
It's a natural
you
prepare.
feel angry and helpless for sure, and
And if those feelings just keep building up, it can lead to a sense of shutdown.
shutdown.
Yeah, like giving up because you've learned that nothing you do can change the outcome.
Oh, that makes sense. It reminds me of that experiment with the dogs, the ones that were repeatedly shocked. Even when they had a way to escape,
Right.
they eventually just gave up. They learned that the pain was unavoidable.
That's a really powerful image, and it shows how this cycle works. The constant negative news creates fear. The fear leads to anger and helplessness.
And eventually we just tune out.
Right, even when there might be ways to engage and make a difference.
But here's the thing, even when I'm feeling totally overloaded,
Uh-huh.
I still find myself doom scrolling, like I'm addicted to the anxiety. Why do we
Yeah.
do that?
It's counterintuitive, right? But remember, our brains are wired to seek out information, especially when we feel threatened. We crave certainty, we crave control, so we keep consuming news, hoping to find answers or reassurance, even if it's just making us more anxious.
Okay, so we're stuck in this loop feeling anxious and helpless. But the Scientific American article throws us a lifeline.
Oh, yeah.
It reminds us that humans are incredibly resilient.
It's true, we are, when you think about all the challenges we've faced as a species.
Wars, famines, natural disasters.
Yeah, and yet we're still here. We find ways to adapt, to cope, to rebuild.
Okay, that does give me a little bit of hope.
Good.
But how do we apply that resilience to something that feels like this never-ending news cycle.
Well, one psychologist in the article compared the initial shock of the current political situation to like a car accident.
Oh, okay.
It's jarring and disorienting, maybe even painful, but eventually we adjust.
So we learn to navigate this new reality.
Exactly. And while the news cycle can make it feel like the accident keeps happening,
Yeah.
there are peaks and valleys. Think of it like waves crashing on the shore. Each one might feel overwhelming in the moment, but eventually it recedes and you find your footing again.
I like that. So how do we find our footing amidst all this chaos? Did the article have any tips?
They did, and some of them are surprisingly simple. First and foremost, remember to breathe.
Wait, seriously, just breathing.
I know it sounds basic, but try it right now. Just a few deep, slow breaths. It sounds cliche, but it really does calm your nervous system and brings you back to the present moment.
Okay, taking a deep breath, I can actually feel my shoulders relaxing a little. What else have you got?
Another helpful tip is to try and see the bigger picture. Instead of getting lost in the daily whirlwind of events, step back and try to connect the dots.
Okay.
What are the underlying patterns? What are the administration's broader goals and priorities?
So it's like looking for the forest instead of getting lost in the trees.
Exactly. Let's say you're feeling overwhelmed by all the news about funding cuts to arts programs. Instead of seeing it as an isolated incident, try to view it within the context of the administration's broader agenda. Maybe it reflects a pattern of prioritizing certain areas over others, or a shift in cultural values.
That's a really helpful reframing. It helps you understand the why behind the headlines.
Right.
Which can make the information feel less chaotic. It's like finding the missing puzzle piece.
Precisely. And that sense of understanding, even if it's understanding something we don't like, can be incredibly grounding.
Yeah, it's like, okay, I see what's happening here. Now I can figure out how to respond.
Exactly.
Speaking of responding, the article also talked about being more mindful about how we consume news.
Yes.
Any practical advice there? Because honestly, it feels like it's everywhere.
I know what you mean. It's tough to escape, but there are ways to manage it. First, experiment with different formats.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, if you usually get your news from TV, try reading it instead. Visual media tends to be more emotionally charged, so switching to text can sometimes take some of the edge off.
So it's not just about what we're consuming, but how we're consuming it.
Exactly. Another tip is to set designated news checking times. Instead of constantly refreshing your feed, pick specific times of day to catch up and then stick to them.
Okay, so it's about creating boundaries.
Yes. Preventing the news cycle from dictating your entire day.
Like building a fence around the anxiety.
I like that. And of course, limiting social media is crucial.
Yeah.
It's a breeding ground for negativity and emotional contagion. So stepping away from it even for a few hours can make a big difference.
You're preaching to the choir here, but seriously, it's so hard to resist that urge to scroll, especially when it feels everyone else is doing it.
It is. But remember, you have the power to choose what you expose yourself to. You don't have to get swept up in the collective frenzy.
Right. The article also talked about the importance of seeking out positive news stories.
Yeah.
As a kind of counterbalance to all the negativity.
Absolutely. It's so important to give your brain a break from that constant barrage of bad news.
For sure.
Look for stories about scientific breakthroughs, artistic achievements, community initiatives, anything that inspires you and reminds you that there's still good in the world.
It's like hitting the refresh button on your mental state.
Exactly. And speaking of things that can refresh your perspective, the article also emphasized the power of personal connection.
Personal connection? You mean like actually talking to people? In person?
Yes. Spending time with loved ones, engaging in hobbies, connecting with nature. These activities nurture our sense of well-being and remind us that there's more to life than the 2047 news cycle.
It's like building up your reserves of inner strength.
Precisely. And when you feel strong and connected, you're better equipped to handle the challenges that inevitably come your way.
I have to say, even though this is a heavy topic,
Yeah.
this deep dive has been really insightful. It's like we've taken this big, scary topic, news fatigue, and broken it down into these manageable pieces.
That's the goal. It's easy to feel powerless when the news cycle feels like it's just spinning out of control, but we really do have more power than we realize.
So we can choose how we engage, how we respond,
How we take care of ourselves.
how we protect our mental well-being.
Exactly.
And it all goes back to that idea of reframing, right? Like changing how we think about the news, about our fears, about what's even possible.
It all starts with recognizing that feeling overwhelmed is a completely natural response.
To the world right now,
To the world right now. It doesn't mean you're weak or incapable.
it means you're human.
Exactly.
So what's the key takeaway here? What do you hope people listening will walk away with?
I want them to know they're not alone. Millions of people are feeling the same way, grappling with the same anxieties, and there are things that can help.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From breathing exercises and mindful news consumption to personal connection and looking for positive stories.
It's like a toolkit.
It's a toolkit for navigating this crazy world.
And remember, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one person might not work for another.
Right.
So the key is to experiment, find what resonates with you, and be kind to yourself along the way.
Yeah, no need to add self-judgment on top of everything else.
Exactly. We're all just doing our best to deal with a really challenging world.
For sure. So before we go, is there anything else you want to leave folks with?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about coping with the current news climate, but what if we could do more than just cope?
I like where you're going with this.
What if we could use this as an opportunity for growth?
Oh, wow.
Difficult times, they often force us to confront our values, to figure out what really matters.
To get clear.
Yeah, and they can push us to become more resilient, more compassionate, more engaged in creating the world we want to see.
So the question we'll leave you with today is, how can you take action based on what you've learned today?
Yeah.
Not just to survive, but to thrive.
To thrive.
In this challenging and ever-changing world.
To make it better.
How can you use this information to empower yourself and make a positive difference in whatever way feels meaningful to you?
We believe in you.
We do. Stay curious, stay engaged, and never underestimate the power of your own voice and actions.
Your voice matters.
That wraps up our deep dive into news fatigue in 2025.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone.